So we are finally in the animation part of this course, which is super exciting. But before we get into actually doing some keyframe animation, I thought it would just be a good idea to briefly talk about the history of animation, the art form, and how it's kind of developed from where it began. And the reason why I kind of want to talk about, its history and some theory is because a lot of the choices and a lot of the terms that we'll be using when we talk about this kind of stuff will be kind of grounded in its history and its development. So it's kind of important for you to understand where some of the decisions that I'm going to make are coming from. I also think it's important just to understand how animation has been shaped as an art form throughout its history. So yeah, I just think it's helpful to kind of briefly discuss these kind of things. So as you might know, animation has been around since like the 16th century, where it was mostly using some form of like physical trickery to give the illusion of a sense of motion. And as you might also know, traditional animation is the art form where you basically just draw one image after another in a sequence, and when they are played back to you, you will interpret it as animation or motion, basically. And this type of animation was mainly brought into like mainstream media by Walt Disney Studios and among other very early adapters of this art form. And then later on in the 90s, almost 100 years later, with the help of computers, a new kind of art form of animation got developed where we could create computer-generated images, or also known as CGI, to both assist us with the animation process by interpolating between our keyframes, but also rendering, photoreal environments and so on. So once we started using computers in this way, we didn't have to draw every single frame manually, since the computers could help us with that. So naturally, that became one of the primary tools for animation. And with that said, traditional animation, or hand-drawn animation as it's also known as, is obviously very much still around and very present within the animation industry. It's just that we kind of combine hand-drawn animation with computers now as well, because you end up drawing it on a tablet that then pipes into a computer, and then you do compositing and stuff within the computer. So the human element of still drawing every single frame is still there, but we have some help from the computers, so we don't have to literally draw on a sheet of paper and then scan it in on film and that kind of stuff. So with that said, I'll just do a brief run through of one of the whole scripts of animation that you will eventually run into if you get into animation in some form, which are the 12 principles of animation. And the 12 principles of animations were introduced by two Disney animators that were there basically from the beginning. And their names were Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. And they wrote a book called The Illusion of Life. And this is kind of where they sat down and actually defined each of these principles. And since then, we've basically been using it as some form of handbook on how to pursue and try and achieve the best animation possible. And obviously, these are principles that were founded way before 3D animation even existed. It was basically only traditional animation and maybe some form of stop motion animation where you could apply this to. However, even though you are working in a more modern type of animation, these principles are still relevant in many cases, and they will help you achieve a better animation if you follow them somehow. And I won't sit down and go through each single principle, because there are some really, really good articles and video essays on this kind of topic. Like, for example, this video by Vincento Lodigiani, where he basically uses a couple of cubes just to explain each principle. And it's super well animated and super well explained. So I would highly recommend just watching through it. And then you can just hop back to this lesson after that. I'll also put a link to this article kind of explaining each principle more in depth, but also giving you image examples of each principle, which is super helpful just in case you want to get into it more in depth. So I'll leave this link in the lesson notes so you can take a look at that. And once you've finished watching these, you'll probably notice that not all of these translate or apply to 3D animation, as they sometimes refer to hand-drawn techniques like the solid drawing principle, for example. And it makes sense, since these principles were founded way before we could do computer-generated images, and they had to actually sit down and focus on, the composition of the drawing and stuff. But we can instead interpret some of these principles in our own medium and kind of connect the dots in our head. So, for example, a solid drawing can refer to the fact that we should just keep in mind how our composition looks and just make sure that we can interpret certain body parts without confusing them for one another, and just make sure that our camera angle works for the purpose of the type of animation that we're trying to achieve, for example. So even though animation as an art form has changed drastically since these principles were founded, that doesn't really change their purpose. And like as humans, we kind of have these pre-programmed ideas of how we view people, just like looking at their body postures. Like if someone is standing up tall, they feel very confident, and the opposite if they are like a bit more hunched over and like a bit smaller. So if we can mimic these things when we are animating, we can easily communicate these emotions without even having to use words. And that to me is like how you achieve a very good animation, if you manage to do that. So yeah, hopefully that was easy enough to grasp. And now, since we've kind of glanced over the history and like the foundations of animation, we can kind of hop into what animation is in Cinema 4D and in the 3D space. So yeah, I'll see you in that lesson.